We're almost done with Chalcedonian Christology. Woohoo! Again, I think this is interesting, but I know it's tough. I want to talk just for a few minutes about what happened after Chalcedon and then the Rowan Williams reading and what it might have to tell us about what Christians have thought the Chalcedonian definition was trying to do. So, first, in the aftermath of Chalcedon, not all Christians got on board. This is the first real split, major split within Christendom, and it remains today. So there were two major groups that didn't get on board with the Chalcedonian definition. One, the Nestorian churches, which still exist today, primarily in the Middle East, and then what are called the Oriental Christian churches, including the Coptic churches. I have a picture of one right here. These churches are ancient. They're, for instance, very prevalent in Egypt. The Nestorian churches were, as you might imagine, Nestorian. The Oriental Christian churches tended to think that Chalcedon gave too much to the Nestorian position, that it overemphasized the duality of the natures and didn't say strongly enough that this is one person. That is all I'm going to say about that. So first, significant split in Christianity starting in the 5th century. The thing about Chalcedon is that, as Rowan Williams says, not in the piece that you read, but in other places, he has said, Chalcedon was an exercise in plate spinning. The theologians there were trying to keep a lot of vocabularies in play. They were trying to think through the various objections groups had to each other and come up with a position that honored them all. But that meant that coming out of Chalcedon, you would still need to kind of work through what the language meant. And that is what Rowan Williams does in his piece. I'm here drawing both from what we read in the piece from Williams and things he said other places. You might be asking, why would I care what Rowan Williams thinks? Well, Rowan Williams was the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's a pretty cool job to have. He's also a scholar of patristics. Remember, patristics are the thinkers of the early church. And he's worked a lot on thinking through Christology and what it means. He also, for the record, you can Google him because you're at home and what else are you going to do, has awesome eyebrows and a really cool accent. That doesn't make you a great theologian, but it's kind of fun. Okay, so what does Chalcedon end up meaning, at least for some part of the Christian world? The couple things I'm going to say here are a little bit tough. I'm throwing them out there because I think they're important points, but if this just is head spinning to you, deep breath, pay more attention to the second two. The first thing that Williams and others point out is the relationship between the human and divine is asymmetrical. Chalcedon sort of makes it sound like, well, a little bit like Nestorius. Human nature, divine nature, boom. And that they're equal. That's true in the sense that Jesus is fully divine and fully human. It's not true in the sense that human nature and divine nature are just not the same thing. They're qualitatively different. What makes God God is just different than what makes people people. Among other things, God is the source of life. Human beings don't have in themselves the source of life. God is infinite. People are finite. What else would there be? God creates. People are created. So it's not that these are kind of two natures on the same playing field coming together. What that ends up meaning, again, this is where it gets a little bit head-spinning, is not that you have human nature standing next to divine nature, whoosh, like, united like that, but something that I think of as being more like this. The divine animating every inch of the human. If you want to think about it like this, it's like a light. That's the human nature. and then the electricity running through it and animating it, illuminating, making it go is the divine. What that means is that the divine nature affects or changes the human nature, but the human nature of Jesus doesn't change the divine nature. This goes to kind of what Arius was concerned about. Does having a logos in a human being change God? No, theologians after Chalcedon says. God can affect creation without then creation changing God. And that's even true in the incarnation. So, for example, out of Chalcedon, people will say God died because Jesus died. They don't mean God actually died, that the source of all life and being ceased to exist. What they mean is that anything you can say of Jesus, you can say of God, because Jesus was so animated by God. Everything that Jesus does is animated by God. That's what Williams is talking about in his text when he says that what you see in Jesus is an unbroken animation of a human being by God. If you want to know what God looks like in human form, you look at Jesus. It's an absolutely perfect translation, if you want to put it like that, of what God is like into human form. So yes, when God is in human form, God dies for humanity. Does God, big G God up there somewhere, die? No, because according to Christian theology, then the universe would collapse. But you can say that God died because Jesus died. All right, again, I know that one is kind of tough. Keep it tucked away. If it made sense, great. If not, chew. We'll come back to it. The other piece of that then that Williams talks about in his text, kind of talks around a little bit, but does want to emphasize, is that the relationship between the divine and human is non-competitive. What does he mean by that? We'll go to the image that he presents of a musician playing another composer's piece of work. The musician is perfectly translating that composer's piece of work. But in so doing, the musician doesn't become less that musician. Yo-Yo Ma doesn't become less Yo-Yo Ma when Yo-Yo Ma plays Bach perfectly. In fact, Williams would argue, Yo-Yo Ma becomes more Yo-Yo Ma when Yo-Yo Ma plays Bach perfectly. Yo-Yo Ma is also a cool name, even though he wasn't a 4th century theologian. In other words, because it's not human nature, divine nature on the same playing field, but human nature being animated by divine nature, what we can say is that humans and God aren't trying to compete for control or space. Think of it this way. When my 6-year-old son comes into my bed sometimes in the middle of the night because he's cold, he takes up space. He takes up my space. We are competing for space because we're the same kind of creatures. That's not, however, how it is with humans and God. Humanity doesn't lose space because God has space. In fact, here's my son now. I'm going to pause. So when my son comes into a room where I am videoing a lecture for Religion 212, we take up the same kind of space. That's a competitive model. The relationship between the Word and Jesus here is non-competitive. It's kind of like air. I'm not competitive with oxygen. Oxygen allows me to be. It doesn't take up space that I need. Now, some of you are scientists are saying, well, there's a point at which oxygen would take up. Okay, fine. But you get what I'm saying, right? Or electricity doesn't take up space from the light that it's lighting. Rowan Williams is saying that what's true here of Jesus, that the divine animating this human being fully, completely, and perfectly doesn't make the human being less human. In fact, he'll argue, it makes him more human. God being closer to us, according to Williams, doesn't make us less, it makes us more. Humans and God are not competing for space. Okay. These next 2 points, I think, are simpler. Williams will also say, here quoting other archbishops of Canterbury, because apparently that's what you do when you're an archbishop of Canterbury, you quote the other ones, is that the relationship between the divine word or the Son in Jesus and the human in Jesus is this, that God is Christ-like and in him there is no unChrist-likeness at all. In other words, what you see this human being Jesus do is what God would do. It's absolutely reliable. So when Jesus suffers for his friends, that's what God would do in human form. When Jesus needs, you can see that there is, as William said, this sense that God is both giving and receiving within God's self. When Jesus loves, you can say that's how God loves. So the relationship between the human and divine coming out of Chalcedon is such that theologians are able to say what we see in Jesus is how God is. There's no moment where we're saying, well, that's just human and there's no God in that part of what Jesus did. How Jesus is how God is in human flesh. Full stop. It's a perfect translation of divinity into humanity, or if you want to use the musical metaphor Rowan Williams does, it's a perfect translation of a composer's music into an instrumentalist's playing of that music. Finally, Williams says, not so much in this text but in other places, although again it's implicit in this text, that humanity is not a problem. Humanity is not a problem to be overcome. God didn't make a mistake in making humans. That Jesus' humanity doesn't have to be less human in order to be good or to be used by God. In fact, Jesus' humanity is absolutely used by God, perfectly used by God, which says that humanity, in theory, could be. We don't have to be less human in order to be animated by God, according to Williams, using the ideas that come out of Chalcedon. Humanity is not a problem. Does it need to be animated by God? Absolutely. But going back to what we've seen before, theologians have said, well, it always needed to be animated by God. That was the point. God made humanity to be animated, to be enlivened, to be in relationship with God. And that's where humanity is actually at its fullest and its best. All right, here's our chart. You might at this point want to pause and fill it out, see how you're doing, see how you're tracking, see where your questions might be if you want to set up a meeting and talk through some of these things with me over Google Meet or Google Hangout or whatever Google is calling it these days. But when you're ready, you can come here. And here's what I might say. The Chalcedon version, God still immutable, still unchanging, still big G God. Jesus, still consubstantial with God, still the Son that is fully God, but also fully human, and is the unbroken act of God in human life, is what it looks like for God to be human, completely, without reservation, full stop. And then finally, what does Chalcedon tell us about right relationship? Well, going back to what Gregory of Nazianzus said, what is not assumed is not healed. If Jesus didn't assume some part of our humanity, that hasn't been healed. So salvation demands the full assumption, the full taking on of our humanity by Jesus in order for it to be healed. But here's the kicker. Our humanity can be fully healed. We don't stop being human, we become healed or restored humanity. Okay, we got through Christology. Woohoo! Next up, Augustine, who you'll probably like for a while and then stop liking. Oh well. See you next time.